Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Hey everyone, and welcome to Raising Parents, the Parenting Science Insights podcast, produced by Ella Massal, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Dina Sargeant. Let's get started. Hey guys, and welcome back. Milestones, that is coming to a stage in development where they'll be going through so many firsts. And while it's important to get your camera ready, it is just as important to know what you're supposed to expect and understand some stages of progression and regression. Joining us today is psychology professor and director of the Barnard Center for Toddler Development. She was also a developmental advisor for the amazing show we all know and love, Sesame Street, and currently the developmental advisor for a new Apple TV show in the works, Rex and Friends. Dr. Tovah Klein, thank you so much for joining me, Tovah.
I'm excited to be here.
Now, with your experience in psychology, what is your usual role in sort of helping parents understand their toddler's development?
So I get to spend my days, my life, kind of living and breathing the toddler world. I run a research and teaching and learning center at Barnard College, which is the women's undergraduate college that's affiliated with Columbia University. And so this is a very vibrant, real place where toddlers come each day for sort of a preschool for 2.25 hours. And our students work in that center. They take a psychology course related to it. And so I spend my time observing toddlers, thinking about toddlers, and then translating what they're doing, why they're doing it, about many what can be challenging or perplexing behaviors to parents and to other professionals. And to add to that, I actually have the pleasure of also doing research on this really ripe, rapidly developing stage of development, trying to understand better the influence of parents on children's early development and then their development over time as well.
Mm-hmm. And so what made you want to work with toddlers and specifically toddlers? Because I know there's so many different life development, stage development. So what specifically about toddlers really made an interest to you?
Yeah, it's a question that comes up a lot because it's an age and a stage that not many people in the field want to be sort of sinking into because it's a really confusing stage of development, but also it's very hard to study them. So from a research perspective, they don't answer questions, they don't sit still, they don't follow along. So it can be challenging. And yet what always drew me to early development, and then over the years has drawn me from, well, this is early development in a base, and let me try to understand equally as important development over time as children get older and teenagers and whatnot, was just a fascination with how toddlers sort of lived in their own world. They weren't so concerned with what other people thought or rules or sort of what we would call socialized ways of acting. But really what's always drawn me to this age, beyond the delight and the wonder and the joy, is that when you think about development, that early parent-child relationship is so important. And early attachment, we know from decades of research, is a foundation. It can be a really good foundation to build on, or it can be a foundation with a lot of cracks and bumps that we need to work to intervene and repair so that the child can get on a better path.
It's always interesting when I hear people working with toddlers because, like you said earlier, they don't sit still, they don't sort of play, they play by their own rules, and it's fascinating to sit and watch them. So is it a lot of just observing their behavior and how their mannerisms are rather than just sitting there and talking with them?
Yeah. So I mean, I have this luxury. For the last 3 decades, I've run a center, and during the pandemic, we actually designed and built a new physical space. And in our old space and our new space, we have this long, large observation room. It's a one-way mirror. The children see themselves in that mirror. But our college students, professionals, parents, and professionals across fields from all over the world come and sit in there. But I also get to be in that observation room, watching, observing, thinking about, why do toddlers generally do what they do? But equally important, why does this child at this moment have this emotion or this feeling? And what can we do to support that child? And that's really lifelong development, right? Every human wants to be understood. Please, try to see what I'm feeling, what I'm thinking. And that's very true in these early years when children are just beginning to come into the world and emerge as their own person, but very much need that parent or that guardian who's their main protector. And so there's a back and forth between I want to be myself and I need you. And I see it played out over and over again in the most delightful ways or in really hard ways where children are very upset. And so a lot of observation is not only needed, but I love it. In order to think about, like, what are the research questions we ask? Or how do I help a parent understand what's going on with a child? Or how am I going to teach students, seniors at Barnard and Columbia about what goes on, say, during separation? And that is really based in observation. Just as an aside, I'm about to go to South Africa this week. And I'll be working in a program there for 2 weeks. That's in one of the townships. I was there like 8 years ago and I'm going back. And one of the questions they asked me was, how much time do I want to observe before I start like meeting with the teachers and talking about children and the teachers' questions? And I said, as much time as you could possibly build in. The longer and more I can observe, the better I can be to enter the teacher's world and the children's world, and then hopefully be of help to them.
Especially with the cultural differences as well, there's going to be a huge sort of look into, is it culture that's sort of determining how a toddler is going to act, or they don't all act the same way, and then sort of build in the culture afterwards?
Yeah. So that's the culture and it's the age. So I'll be in the early childhood program, and then I'll be in the elementary school, which is like ours, kindergarten to 5th or 6th grade. And so I just kept saying, the more time you build into my schedule to observe, the more I can understand your program, all of you. And I think we probably underestimate how important it is to step back and look.
No, that's perfect. And thank you so much for that introduction. It's so great to sort of get to talk about toddler development. I don't know, I always find it so interesting. So it's always something that's on my mind as to how we sort of input different information into a toddler and sort of let them take what they want and then let them just sort of build on their own. So thank you so much for that introduction. And before we get deeper into it, I'd love to get to know some of your interests and maybe some of your recommendations as well. And hopefully a little icebreaker before we get into the deeper questions. So to start off with, what is a favorite book of yours?
This is always a funny question because I'm like, a current book or a past book? So I'm going to start with a past book, which is,
okay.
I don't know if, out of the many, many books out there and that I still hope to read one day. But the book that always comes to mind for me is a book called A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, which is a book that I had to look it up to see, is that still in print? It's still in print. I mean, I'm sure it came out, I don't know if it was 50 years ago or more, about a girl's coming of age in Brooklyn. I think it takes place like at the turn of the 20th century, but I read it as probably a teenager or a tween, as we now say. And I was born in Brooklyn. I didn't grow up there, but I was born there. So I'm sure that resonated with me. But it was really about this girl's ups and downs and the good and the bad and the challenges and the joys. And when I thought about it for today, I was like, oh, that's what I do in life. I study the good and the bad. I'm interested in, how do people face the bad in life and get the supports they need and incorporate that and not let it stop them. Oh yeah, I was doing that in that book as well. So it still delights me to think about that book.
No, that sounds like a really interesting book. I haven't heard of it before, but now I'm really looking into it. It definitely sounds like my kind of genre when it comes to the coming of age part, especially going on from a teenager to an adult or to what they expect an adult to be. So to have that idea, that's such a great book. Thank you for that recommendation. Now, what movie have you enjoyed recently?
So it's funny. I'm not a big movie goer. And of course, the pandemic, put everything on our small screen. So then I was like, forget it. But I did at least in the US, we had, the release of Barbie and Oppenheimer the same weekend. So
Yeah.
I did within a week, I went to a movie theater with somebody and first saw Barbie and then went back and saw Oppenheimer. But I think I'm going to talk about Barbie because I teach at Barnard College. It's been my faculty home for my entire career. And Greta Gerwig, who, wrote this movie and produced this movie and directed this movie, is a Barnard graduate. So
Oh, wow.
part of it is that here we are at this incredible women's college that raises or educates women to be bold and out in the world and activists. And there she comes up with, this incredible movie. And I kind of went in skeptical. Like, when I was a child, my mom was like, there are no Barbies in this house, but I played with them at my best friend's house. And I think it's a fantastic movie because on top of like all of the whimsical and fun and beautiful filming of this movie and music is a really serious message about women and who we are, and also our relationship with men and in the boxes that they're also put into and forced into. So it's both a feminist movie, but also equally for men to say, wait a minute, do I want to be put in that box? No woman wants to be put in the Barbie box, but men also don't want the confines of you have to act this way. So I think it's a really fantastically done film.
Yeah, that's the thing that I sort of relate to as well. Like when it comes to the Barbie aspect, I think everyone sort of related to that, but you sort of forgot about Ken as well. And then when I sort of mentioned Ken, they're like, oh, I never thought about it like that. Because there's always something, because you focus so much on the Barbies, focus so much on Barbie being put into this figure of this is what you're supposed to be. But Ken also got everything injected into him all at once of how he thinks a man is supposed to be. So he kept doing that. And yeah, it's so interesting to sort of look at Ken compared to Alan and sort of compare. There's two ways that you can go about this.
And I enjoyed all of it. I felt like there were just lots of messages in it. And, there's all kinds of critiques, and I can agree with some of them. But I think as a major motion picture that has a huge audience worldwide, I felt like the messaging was really important.
Yeah, no, I think everyone sort of learned about from that movie about how we're realizing how society is trying to pin us against each other all the time. So no, it was great to sort of see that in such a great relatable visual, which is something that you don't really get quite often. Now, when it comes to podcasts, are you listening to any podcasts or maybe a genre of podcasts at the moment?
No, probably for lack of time. But when I do listen, I tend to listen to things like Krista Tippett on NPR here, or This American Life, Fresh Air. So they tend to be podcasts about people's lives. Maybe somebody has a new book and it's a memoir. I've certainly listened recently to a couple of podcasts and interviews with Barbara Streisand, who I grew up loving and kind of idolizing. And here she has this incredible memoir out, but it's like 1,000 pages. Thinking, when am I going to read that? So instead, I've been listening to podcasts. So I tend to listen to podcasts that are about people and their lives. Tends to be my genre.
Okay. No, that's a good genre to be in. It really fits in with the development area that you're in as well. So I can definitely see where your interest sort of comes in.
Yeah. I'm very curious about people and who they are, which is why I enjoy both working with and studying and helping parents with children across ages, because first there's the 2 or the 3 or the 4-year-old, and then there's the 10 or the 14-year-old, and there's all these continuities and yet developmental changes. And so I'm very interested in people's lives, and then adults or older people who have had long lives. I mean, there's so much you can listen and learn from, people who have lived a long time.
No, I definitely agree. There's so much that we sort of forget that they do have to teach us, and other vice versa as well. There's things that we know that they don't. So there's also that. Now, when it comes to role models, either in your personal life or maybe in professional areas as well, do you have someone or maybe a group of people that you find yourself looking up to?
Yeah. So it's a interesting question because off the top of my head, I was like, well, who would my role models be? But then I realized I've had mentors. And I think role models to me are people probably who mentored me. And I think of sort of my compass, like, what would this person do? One of them is a woman who is turning 103 next week. Or this week. Yeah, she's going to be 103. And she's a psychologist in Cleveland. Her name is Dr. Jane Kessler. She was very early in the field of what was termed abnormal child psychology. She started and she wrote the original textbook on child psychopathology, talking about like children's development varies and some children are at risk. And she's the person who mentored me through like sort of my adolescence. I worked in a program that she started. She's a family friend. And so she was always sort of there saying to me, what are you doing now? What are you thinking about? And we would talk. And she also went to the University of Michigan many years before I went there. So that was sort of, a nice pathway to follow. But one of the things I learned from her, and that just infiltrates my work, is that you have to look at an individual child, and rather than judging them, you have to understand them. And that there may be a wide range of development. There may be some development that's challenging or problematic, but you have to look at the individual child and figure out who they are and what they need. And that has always stayed with me. So she's one. And then when I became a professor at Barnard College, there was a professor there named Lila Brain. And she was on the verge of retiring, and I was just starting. And she and I used to have lunch regularly, or she would come to Barnard. And she was, again, like way ahead of her time as a role model, a woman who had this career and was interested in understanding. She was interested in children's cognitive development and their thinking. But what I took from her is the importance of mentoring students. And again, understanding the people around you, kind of finding your true north, whatever it is, and going for it. And both of these women really spurred me on to say, I might think differently, or I might think outside the box, but that's okay as long as I'm doing it in the service of sort of furthering knowledge and understanding children and parents.
That's such a great role model to have and such a great person to look up to, bunch of people to look up to, especially sort of discovering their own pathway and sort of you adding on to that and being like, okay, I can find my own idea that I want to peruse. I can find my own style. So no, that's a great role model to have, especially in a professional field where you kind of think everything is done, everything is researched, everything is looked at. And then there's just one area that you find that's just your own that is very interesting to sort of deepen in.
Yeah, for sure. And to have women who went way ahead and just did that. Like they didn't have role models. They just went out there and did it.
Yeah, no, I think that adds a whole level of role model criteria that's sort of needed. Is finding someone that does that really starts something. Now, I hope that you're all warmed up before answering even deeper questions today and a little bit looking into what we're talking about in the topic today. Now, I know that everyone has a very different idea as to what parenting is and what the role of being a parent would be. What do you think, either professionally or even personally, the definition of parenting would be for you?
It's a good question because when I think of parenting, it immediately takes me to parent. What's a parent?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know when parenting as a verb kind of came into being. It's been around for a while, but I think it's really this idea of who's a parent, which will then feed into parenting, which is this idea of that person. It may be two people for some children, but who is a parent is somebody who's a protector, because children are dependent. So it's somebody who's raising another human who's smaller, often much smaller for babies, and is nurturing and loving and caring for them and helping them establish a foundation so that they can go on in life and become whoever it is they're meant to be. And so the term parenting, I think, really is about that. Like, how does somebody go about establishing this really intimate and important relationship and doing it on a day-to-day basis that, meeting basic needs, meeting emotional needs, meeting very changing needs. Like, just as you think, I've got this, child changes or life changes or context changes, right? So it's that whole role of being the parent, the one who protects and nurtures and takes care of.
No, that's such a great explanation, because you kind of really see it as even deeper than, okay, I'm a parent, you're the child, you have to do as I say, you have to follow as the way that I've done things and sort of take after me. But when you take it even further, it's also saying that, okay, but I have that responsibility of making sure that they're okay, making sure that they're okay with themselves, they're okay with being how they are, they're okay with the way of the world. And it's even more than just, because when you're a child, you sort of see a parent as being, you have to follow exactly what they do. You have to follow all the rules that they set in place. But on the other perspective, when you think of what a parent is as an adult or as a parent yourself, the definition really changes quite a bit when you're sort of seeing, okay, the role of a parent is to be there for them. And it grows.
And the child needs that. It's really, what does the child need more than anything? They need their basic needs met, to be fed, to be clothed, to be sheltered, to be warm. Really what they need is their basic need to feel safe. And nothing matters more than that. And that comes through establishing a relationship over time. Right? Safety is a two-way street. There's parent, there's child. We establish this trust. We establish safety. And then it gets carried out on an everyday basis. Sometimes things go awry. How do we get back to that eventually? It's that element that's so important.
And especially in toddlers as well. I mean, we're talking about milestones. And I know I mentioned in the intro a little bit earlier of us sort of, they're discovering their first. They're discovering so many different new things. And we see parents like, okay, getting their cameras or taking photos of them, taking their first steps. But there's so much more in that they're now, because the whole world is different for toddlers now. The whole world is, okay, now I can walk places. Now the parent is suddenly having to chase them out of rooms, chase them out of so many areas. So could you walk us through some of the essential milestones and different stages in a toddler development that sort of has that critical link between social and emotional development?
Yeah, it's a huge question, right? This is like, days of, but the toddler years are actually a very wide berth, because, you have the newborn baby who quickly becomes an infant, and the infant who then becomes a young toddler in the, around a year and a half. And then as they start walking and moving further out in the world, but desperately needing that parent to be there when they need them. And then language comes into play, right? So you have physical change, you have language, which is huge, because imagine not having the verbal capacity to convey what you're thinking or feeling, and then starting to have words and then putting them into sentences and then being able to communicate that and receive that. It's a huge change for the younger toddler who becomes sort of, the 2-3-year-old, and then moving into, say, the 4s, then the peer world comes alive for them. Peers are everything. So you go from just getting up on your feet, if you want to call that the young toddler, to I'm in the midst of the peer world and figuring out how to interact and be with peers. And for many children, early reading and literacy, all within this short span of like 2 or 3 years. I mean, it's kind of mind-boggling. So it really does start out that the child is very dependent. The toddler is very dependent on parents. And then they're moving a little bit forward and getting what we call a sense of self. So this is this idea of like, hey, I'm my own person. I have ideas. I want the blue cup. You just handed me the yellow cup. I don't want it.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because I can think more. The child has more language and they've envisioned a blue cup and that's what they want. So for the parent, frustrating. Just take the cup I have. For the child, no, I've got ideas. And that's very empowering. And then when they get language to communicate it, that's even more empowering. And that's what we call agency. I can have an impact because if I put these words out there, then hopefully you'll deliver to me what I'm asking for.
Mm-hmm.
And then they find out that, well, sometimes that happens and sometimes it doesn't. And so now you're dealing with a whole set of new emotions. So the 2.5-year-old is moving into frustration, anger, disappointment.
Mm-hmm.
But they're also moving into things like pride. Because once you have a sense of self and that toddler starts to say, oh, this is who I am. And I really want to figure out how to build that block tower. And I finally get that piece on top and I step back and it stays even for a moment. That feels great. And that's what we call pride. And that sense of like, oh, I did it is what then spurs them on to want to try again or want to keep having an impact on their environment, wanting to move ahead. That's what we call confidence, right?
Mm-hmm.
I can do this. And even if I got frustrated and I had a parent or a teacher or somebody else there help me through that frustration, then eventually I got back up and I went back to do it. Maybe I went back to that puzzle or blocks right after. Or maybe I went back 3 days later. I always say to parents, it doesn't really matter when they go back. It's that eventually they figure something out and there's this moment of, aha. And that's all emotional development. I get frustrated. I have ideas. I get mad. But there's someone there who says to me, it's going to be okay. You can be angry. You can punch this pillow. You can scream. And then I'm going to help you come back down. And I'm going to still love you. That's the really hard part for parents, because in this milestone, as children get more and more of a sense of self, they also get a much broader range of emotions.
Mm-hmm.
And that emotional piece, eventually, over time, with a lot of what I call 2 steps forward, a step back. So I start to interact with peers, and then I'm not quite sure how to do it. So maybe I shove them or I grab from them, and I'm figuring out, oh, why is that person yelling? Oh, that's because I keep grabbing from them. They start then to interact more. And you have to really think about, for the toddler, how many emotions they have to handle in order to interact in a back and forth with another person, let alone another person who's developing on this learning trail with them. It's not like an older person, even an older sibling or a cousin or a friend, let's say a 3-year-old and a 7-year-old. The 7-year-old will kind of come down to their level a bit. Oh, you really want to play with that? Sure, you can have that. But 2 3-year-olds are facing off to equals, and neither of them have a lot of skills.
Yeah.
And right. And they're supposed to be self-centered. I want. So it takes a little time to figure out, oh, I could have some and he could also have some. We could do this together is a learning curve. It's a big learning curve.
Yeah, it's really interesting because when you're talking, because there's a show that's on Netflix about toddlers just in kindergarten, and they're sort of like developing around each other, they're sort of playing around together, and you see them act in so many different ways. Suddenly there's a little group here, there's a little group there. If someone's having a disagreement with one person in that group, they'll move on to the other group, and they won't know exactly how to interact, but they know to cry to get their emotions out of the way and then figure out what to do afterwards. So like, I don't know why, but they always seem like a step further than adults, because if you think about it, adults sort of don't have that time to sit there and really just cry. We have to figure out what we're going to do straight away. But they have that ability and have that knowledge. It's like, okay, my first reaction is to cry, to get that emotion out of the way and then figure out the next emotion. So when you see them as, okay, they're still learning, I'm like, I'm pretty sure they've learned enough, probably but learned more than we have as how to sort of react to certain situations.
Or what you're pointing to is if children feel safe enough to have, what we call negative emotions. So whether that's sadness, anger, frustration, they have to have a certain amount of safety. These are hard emotions. And, and often children are told, don't cry, or, don't act that way, don't get upset. When if they've had the safety of a parent or an environment that says to them, you can be upset, you can't always have what you want, and you can be upset about that. Then they do learn, okay, I can get through this. I got upset. I can get through this. Let's see if we can figure it out. That's what we call resilience. Resilience isn't negating all those emotions. It's like, how do I have those emotions, handle them, understand they're part of me? I'm good sometimes. I'm not so good sometimes. Sometimes things go my way. Sometimes they don't. Those dichotomies, as you're saying, are very hard for adults, let alone for children. And they need a lot of kind of loving support or adults stepping back, which is, I think, what you're pointing out, and seeing, can the children figure this out? They often do. They often do when they're given the room to do it.
So with that space, how can parents sort of navigate those challenges of, for example, a child screaming and yelling in a supermarket or not really getting their way? How can they sort of do that in a space where they still feel like they can still have those emotions, but in a way that's a little bit more, because I know emotions are hard as they're sort of building up, and all they know is to throw a tantrum or to kick and scream and lie down in the middle of an aisle and just kick and scream. But how can parents sort of do that in a way that they're not cutting the child back, but also telling them that that's not something that you do in a public space?
It kind of depends on the child and the age of the child, but nothing's harder than a public tantrum, or maybe there's something harder, but public tantrums, like, it's funny. I have this in my first book, in How Toddlers Thrive, because I think every parent has at least one moment of this public tantrum where, somebody's coming over to you and you think they're just going to ridicule me, or they're going to tell me what a rotten parent I am. And the example I have in that book is of a man walking towards me. I'm outside and he just looks at me as I'm bracing myself for some insult. And he says, just try to enjoy it. Mine's a grown up or something, it goes so fast. And I was so relieved, like, that somebody just said, hey, this is a blip. Just go with the moment. And it is a combination. And I think, parents, in a way, social media is a great thing, but I think it's a really tough thing because there's all this advice. And the real advice is your relationship, right? So what is your relationship? So there are times that you have to pick up that screaming child and maybe put your cart aside and walk outside. Because if you know you have a child who's completely overwhelmed and this meltdown's not going to end, probably the middle of the aisle is not the right place. And maybe you take a break. I can remember many times, I have 3 children, all young adults, picking up a child and leaving a restaurant. Like, this is just not the place to have a tantrum when other people are eating, and just going outside and maybe going for a little walk, helping them calm down, and then going back in and saying, it's going to be hard to sit at the table, but we're going to go back. Your food's going to be there now. It's like a reset. So some of it is connecting, right? Children need connection, and it's hard in those moments. And some of it in public, honestly, is there an exit, at least momentarily? Those family parties where everybody's excited and in the child's face and hugging and kissing and asking, and the child just can't handle it. And you say, no more lollipops, and that's it. It's set them over the edge. Right? Yeah. So it's really is that combination of, what does this child need to be calmer? And sometimes you can do it in the moment. Sometimes you can pick up that child and say, this is really hard. I said, no more sugar cereal. I'm going to put you in the car. And you're kind of talking them down. connecting to them a little bit, hands on them, and you can bring that child down a bit. You say, you can be upset. We're in the grocery store. I'm going to remind you in the grocery store. I'm going to push you down the aisle. You're kind of, giving this calming but clear boundary, right? Like, you can't really do that here. And sometimes that works. But I think what parents need to know is you have to really know your child. And if you've got to get out of there, do it. It's okay. We've all been there. And then the other piece I would say about that is sometimes you have the child that you realize certain situations don't work for them right now. I have a child who I could not for a while take in, I live in New York City. We would go to the drugstore, the CVS or Walgreens or whatever, and you can't get by the checkout counter without going by all these toys and the candy, right at their eye level. And it was a meltdown. And I finally realized, I don't know why it took me so long. Like, I can't take him into a store right now like that. It's not fair to him. It's not going to work, no matter how many times up front I would say. And today we're just going in to buy toothpaste. It wasn't going to work for him. And I just said, you know what? I'm going to wait 6 months and we'll try it again. And then I came up with this thing. I say, we're going to walk by the toys. You can tell me one that you want to get one day, but we're not getting it today. So he came up with this thing where he would point to like this little car and he would say, maybe tomorrow. And I would say, that's right, maybe tomorrow. And it worked. And we could go in the store and we could have a maybe tomorrow. It's what we call delay of gratification, right? It's something that we all have to learn. It starts when they're little, even if you delay them, 30 seconds at home. Like, I'm going to get you more milk. I'm just going to put the dish in the sink. Now I'm getting your milk. You're delaying them a little bit. And then over time, that delay gets more and more. It's what we call patience, which most of us don't have anymore. But right. So it's helping them get to that place. But the bottom line is, in that young child, 2, 3, 4 starts to get a little better at 5, a little better at 6. It keeps getting a little better because brain development is moving forward. The ability to handle impulses, and impulses are those instant, I need it, or, hey, this thing's in my hand and I can throw it, so I throw it. Even if you're not supposed to throw that kind of thing. Those impulses are very hard for them to control at these young ages, and they get better over time. And the parent is literally their brain regulator at that moment. Okay. They're doing it for them. I'm not going to let you throw that. In fact, I'm going to put this here. And if you want something soft to throw, here's a stuffed animal, throw that. That's a way to help them with the impulse.
So when it comes to that delayed gratification that you were just mentioning, the important part, I guess, would be to sort of hold on your word of it as well. So like, okay, if I'm just going to give you your milk, but I'm going to put the dish in the sink, so that you sort of have to follow through with that in order for them to trust that that's the situation that's going to happen, rather than, okay, put the dish in the sink, put laundry on, then get the milk. So there's that need to sort of build it up on that.
Yeah, I like how you've put that. As parents, sometimes we forget that we say we're going to do something and we don't. And then the child actually deserves an apology. You know what? You're right. I did say I was going to get that for you. I'm sorry. Now I'm going to go back and get it. But yes, it's all those interactions, but over a long time. So not every interaction is perfect and shouldn't be. Not every interaction goes right. And again, I think this is a place that's hard for young parents. And I say this with I feel for you, those parents listening, which is, when we see something on Instagram or on, TikTok or whatever media people are using, it's a very static moment. Do it this way. And you know what? Sometimes you are going to do that and sometimes you're not. But over the course of time in a loving relationship, the child builds trust. When mommy says she's going to put that in the sink and get it for me, she generally does. And when she doesn't and I have a meltdown, we can kind of have a redo. I did say I was going to get that for you. Let me get it now. So it's partly for parents to not be so hard on themselves. You have a bad day. You yourself may really melt down with your child, right?
Yeah.
Because you're human. Now, if you're doing that every day, many times a day, say, you know what, you got to get some more support or figure out what's going on for you. There's lots of ways to sort of unpack that. But if in general it's loving enough and now you're having a rough go, you can come back and reconnect to that child, and that's what the child needs.
One of the big things when it comes to a toddler as well is not only their autonomy, but also their self-confidence. So for parents who may be navigating the challenges of helping their toddlers develop a strong sense of self-confidence, what kind of guidance or maybe techniques would you sort of recommend to encourage that space for a healthy expression and making sure that they're okay, making sure that their emotions are understood and validated, but also that it's in a space that they can feel comfortable to do so?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because so the negative emotions are hard. They're hard for most of us. So I'm going to take that in two ways. One is for parents to really think about, what does it feel like to me when my child is angry, when my child is frustrated? Because so much of what the child experiences is the parent's reaction. And then to say, for the parent to say, so where does that come from for me? Like, why is it so hard for me when my child is upset? Because children are supposed to be happy, mad, joyful, sad. It's all of the above. But as parents, and I, again, can say this as a mother myself, we're happiest when our children are like in a good space. They're content enough. You know, they're relaxed, they're laughing. So part of it is doing the work on ourselves. And I will say my new book that's coming out called Raising Resilience, a lot of it is on what I call the you factor. So what is it about us as parents that we're bringing to being a parent? So that's one piece. But the other piece is to really know that in order to build confidence in this sense of I'm going to be okay in the world, which is what we want our toddler who becomes an elementary school age, becomes a teen, and so on. We want them to have a foundation of I can get through the tough moments of the day. My friend won't play with me. The Play-Doh was blue and I wanted red, Daddy said he was making pancakes this morning and he made eggs instead. Whatever it is, those are hard moments for a child to be disappointed or let down. I might think, what's the big deal? I'll make you pancakes tomorrow. But if the child's expectation is that, and they're a child who gets very determined, I've got an idea or an expectation. So to know that they're allowed to be upset about that. And when you say something like, you are so disappointed, you thought we were having eggs, whatever you in your head, you say, this is ridiculous. And you say to them, and tomorrow I'm going to make that. But right now we're having, this instead. You're putting some limits on it to say you can be upset. I'm not running back to the kitchen and making 3 new meals. That's the limit. In the same way, I'll tell you another very practical limit. I see kind of rules and limits as the routines of the day. Do you sit down and have dinner together? And it doesn't have to be a long, drawn-out dinner. But children can eat a meal at a table. And often they want the same seat. So there's daddy's seat, there's, mommy's seat, there's the big sister's seat, there's my seat. That routine is like a limit. I sit here, we eat, we chat. When we're done, we leave the table. Those are reasonable limits. And when the child says, I'm not eating this, or, I don't want broccoli, you can say, fine, you don't have to eat it. This is dinner. We're going to talk about the day a little bit. And if you're done, you're done. Those are reasonable limits without stopping them being happy or sad, but living in their mercurial world a little bit. And so I think the first thing parents have to do is say, she's allowed to be upset. She's allowed to be mad. She's not allowed to not like me, which none of us as parents enjoy, if we're honest, particularly with our first ones. It gets better with second, third, fifth, right? But our first ones, we tend to be a little bit too personalizing the child. If you say, look, more power to him. He's allowed to be mad. I'm going to go get your shoes ready, and then I'm going to come back and get you. You're not focusing so much on trying to move them out of the anger.
So there's a lot when it comes to the toddler's sort of frustration and emotion. And so the way that you're sort of suggesting is just allow them to have that space where they can express it. They can sort of build that confidence of self-soothing in a way, of understanding that this is only a momentary emotion, but it's not, the situation doesn't have to get out of hand. But if you're, as a parent, if you're sort of relying on that and being like trying to calm them down, that adds to the more frustration of the fact that even now the parent's frustrated, and even more like the whole family's frustrated, dinner is ruined, that over that thought of like everything is their fault in a sense.
Yeah. Again, everything is going to be a little bit of a combination, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's about the relationship.
Okay.
So it's not merely, I would say it's not a free-for-all, right? You're not going to be screaming for hours on end. So some of it is labeling emotions, like you're so mad right now. I did say I was going to make pancakes. You're disappointed. We're going to see if we can change this up tomorrow. But right now, it's going to be eggs. And
Mm-hmm.
you're kind of, you can help a child through it without saying to them, stop crying. For some children, it's holding them. I mean, you really have to know your child. There is
Mm-hmm.
no such thing as one right way. So some of it might be some children can be picked up and soothed. Other children need a little bit of space. And you say, you're mad, you're mad, you're mad. Give them something that they can kick, or they can punch, or they can hit. One of my children, I would hand him this teddy bear and he would like squeeze it and throw it and squeeze it and throw it. Wait, emotions are something you want to get out.
Mm-hmm.
Another child, it might be putting your hand on them and kind of calmly breathing with them. This is so hard. This is so, so hard, right? So you're kind of grabbing the emotion where it is a little bit and coming down. Like one of the things I often say to parents is, if your child is really upset and you're being really, really kind of low affect and even, it's going to upset them more. Like think of yourself.
Okay.
If you're upset and a friend says to you, oh, there's nothing to be upset about, it's going to drive you crazy, right?
Yep. Yeah.
Children are the same way, because that emotional arousal is going up very high into a very high zone. And so the question for the parent is, can you go up a little and almost meet it, not at their level, but to say, you're mad. This is so hard for you. And then start to bring them down a bit, right? If you're mad, I got it. I'm going to try to remember tomorrow. I'm going to still get your shoes. Maybe you have your hand on them. You're talking in a kind of up and then down tone, can really help a child start to then calm down. Forget what the problem is. Like often as parents, I'm as guilty as this as anyone. You want to talk through the problem. How many times have I told you after breakfast, you have to brush your teeth, or whatever it is? No human being, 2, 10, or adult, wants to hear what they've done wrong. What that young child really needs is help coming down.
Okay.
And then when they come down and the parent goes, wow, that was so frustrating. You were so angry. I still love you. I'm right here. I still love you. That's where confidence comes from. Oh, that was scary for me as the 4-year-old. That was a lot of emotion. That was intense. Now I'm calmer. Mommy or daddy is right here. We're okay. That's where you build trust in a sense of, I can get through it again. And as children get older, what parents can say to them is, yeah, remember that time you were so mad at your friend? You were so mad. Do you remember what helped you come back together with her? And then the child says, well, I waited at school the next day. I said, maybe we could have lunch together. And they recount either what got them to calm down sometime in the past or got them to reconnect. And that builds confidence too. It's a reminder, oh yeah, I was upset like that before and I did get through it and we did come back together. And those are important moments for older children, like 4-year-olds, if they're very verbal, you can do some of that reminding, certainly 5 and 6-year-olds. It's this kind of like review and saying to them, you have gotten through this before. You'll get through it again. This is hard.
And now we're talking about toddler, but in our practice habit segment of the show, this dealing with something that you do with yourself. So as a practice for yourself, what is something that you do to build your own self-confidence or your own self-reliance if situations sort of don't go your way?
It's a great question. I think in general, the way that I continue to build self-confidence, because I think we need it all the time, insecurities rise up.
Mhm.
Doesn't matter what our age is, I think, or at least certainly for me. And then I say, okay, how can I take on a new challenge, even if it's only a little one? Because getting through a challenge or something that I feel like I can't do that, and then getting to the other side is like, oh, I did do that. And it can be as simple as part of a workout routine.
Mhm.
Like, how many push-ups can I do? Can I get to 10? And thinking there's no way. And then can I get to 12? And then feeling really good because it's very concrete. Can I walk all the way? It's a 5-mile walk. Do I want to do it? And can I? Yeah. If I allot enough time, I can probably still get there on time. Like some challenge that allows me to say, am I willing to open that door? So I will say taking on a second book, which is something I really wanted to write. I really, really, really wanted to write it, but I kept thinking, I don't know. I don't have time. What if I don't have enough to say? Will the publishers agree with what I have? Just all of these insecurities. And then I thought one day, this is so important. I have to write this and I'm just going to do this. Not just, it's a big undertaking. But now that the book is getting closer to publication, I'm like, oh my gosh, what did I do? Yeah. And I think you can do that in your everyday life, whether it's a complicated recipe. I sometimes do that. I have a son who loves to cook, and I'll be like, okay, let's find a recipe. I have a couple sons actually who like to cook. But when I first look at those recipes, I think, oh my gosh, there's 10 steps to this. But then I start breaking it down. It's not really 10, and then I make that thing and I put it on the table. I feel great. That builds confidence. So it can be both in big ways and in small ways.
Mm-hmm. So it's allowing yourself to take on something that you think you could never do, but when you do it, there's a whole lot of understanding of, oh, okay, that means there's no thing I can't do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or
Okay,
at least there's one more thing that I did do that I thought that I was hesitant. Sometimes I think I can't do it. And sometimes I think, can I? Or do I want to? So I think it's actually, like in the bigger realm, it's facing fears or facing worries. Sometimes there's a challenge that maybe I just don't want to take on. Just don't want to do that. And I'm not going to. But it's more often, am I letting myself be held back for some reason? And then making that choice of, okay, I'm going to try that. And I'm going to just see how far I can get.
So how do you think that this practice has sort of impacted the way that you see family, the way that you see life in itself?
Well, I think it's probably because I've always been somebody who's interested in sort of the bad things. So I'll give you an example. When I was a kid, I grew up in the Midwest. There would be these huge storms and I couldn't wait for them to stop so I could go what I called survey the damage. My dad and I would go for a long walk and we'd see all the trees that were down, all the broken stuff. I loved going towards that. I'm the kind of person who, if there's a fire, I want to see it. And then I have to say to myself, is that smart right now? Like, is that? But then that's a segue to say, when I work with families and children, I've always been interested in there are bad things that happen in life, but I think we can help people get through them. And so it's what we call trauma or high stress, or if it's continuous, toxic stress. And my interest really my whole life has been, how can I understand children and their needs, and how can I understand how to support them when really bad things happen? And so I think that's somehow related to my own, like, if there's fear, there's something stopping me, I have to do that really hard work. It's not always easy to figure out, well, what's stopping me? And can I move forward? Because sometimes I can't, or sometimes either I choose not to or I'm stymied. But it's when I do choose to move forward that I think is the part of me that also says we can support people to get through really hard stuff, little hard stuff or big, terrible stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the work that really, really interests me. So when I'm working with families, like on a day-to-day basis, there's a lot of support around, this is really hard. You have a child who is melting down every time you leave the house, every time you come to school, every time you go to grandparents' house or anywhere new. That's hard, but it doesn't mean it's insurmountable, and it doesn't mean it's going to last forever. And people get out of all kinds of hard situations. We had a family a few years ago at my center who escaped a fire in the middle of the night. A mom, her child, a dog. They got out, barely, but their neighbors didn't. That's a terrible situation. But I would never want to say, oh, this 3-year-old's doomed. Was she frightened? Was she having all kinds of nightmares? Yes. But could I work with that family and support them through it? Yes. And that's the part of life that's really, to me, both challenging and rewarding. And as a clinical psychologist, when I was in training in grad school, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted adults who had experienced trauma when they were younger to understand what the lifelong process was, and children who were having a really rough time. And often it was around either abuse or kind of the afflictions of poverty or strained financial situations for families. I really felt like if I could understand what people needed to be supported, then we could help them through. And that's what parents are doing every single day, by the way, with their children. How can I help them through these really challenging situations? And how can I understand myself?
Wow, so there's a lot of learning in yourself as well when sort of dealing with families. There's a lot of, okay, how can I take this and what have I learned from what they've gone through? So it's also a journey on yourself as well, which is always really interesting to sort of know how it impacts you as well, hearing those situations impacts how you sort of understand the world.
Yeah. Which I think for anybody who works with people, but certainly with families. So whether that's as a psychologist or a mental health person, as a teacher, as an educator, sometimes we have to factor in where we are today. Who am I today? Which is different than who I was, last year or certainly 10 years ago, because we're always growing and developing too. And our lives are changing, right? At some point I became a parent, and then my children got older, and then my own parents got sick, and I learned things about myself. Like all of that adds to understanding of self, but hard work often to understand ourselves, and then how we can relate to people that we want to support and help. So it's a back and forth.
Yeah, there's a lot that you can sort of do both on both sides, learn yourself and learn about others. Now, this ties us in really well with the last section of our show, which is the open mic. Now, this gets you to share anything that you're wanting to share with us, or maybe something we didn't get to discuss throughout the show. So in the last minute or so, I'd love to give you the floor and share what's on your mind with us.
Well, I can say I have an upcoming trip that I'm very excited about, but I also have an upcoming book called Raising Resilience that I'm equally excited about. And it's going to be out in September. And it's going to cover a lot of what we just discussed, which is, this is a book that goes across ages and asks that question about what are parents doing in the everyday that helps children develop those skills or confidence or sense of self so that they can face the everyday sort of challenges and insults, but also the bigger, harder parts of life that will come our way. We all know that because everybody lived through a pandemic. But there are not so good things happening in people's lives. And so what is it about that parent-child relationship? This book really unpacks it to say, it's this relationship that matters. And I want to help parents feel like I got this.
Well, that's such an interesting book. So it's coming out in September?
Yes, September 3rd, 2024, it will be out. Yeah, HarperCollins, yeah.
Oh, wow. And those can be found on Amazon, or is it in
It can be in
bookstores?
Amazon, certainly in bookstores, all of the above.
Oh,
Yeah.
perfect.
Yeah.
Well, I'll definitely have a link down below. When it
Great.
does come out, we'll definitely have a link down below for that. And your other book as well, which is, I forgot the name of
It's
it.
on toddlers, How Toddlers Thrive, which is
Toddlers
really a
Thrive.
look into the toddler world so that parents can have a kind of better frame on it and enjoy life with them that much more. Because if you shift how you're thinking about those joyful little beings, you can be a different parent and really move in their world.
Okay, perfect. I'll have a link down below to that as well. Now, if our listeners want to find out a little bit more about you, is there a certain place that I can send them off to?
Yes. Right now, I do have a website, howtoddlersthrive.com, and soon I will have a new one up and running, tovahklein.com, which will cover both my books. And I am on Instagram at Tovah Klein.
Okay, perfect. I'll have all the links down in the description for everyone to access it more easily. Now, thank you so much, Tovah, for joining me on the show today. It was amazing getting to discuss toddler development and putting my nerdy brain on and learning about things that I don't get to see on the day-to-day basis. So it was great to sort of discuss that.
Thank you for having me. Really enjoyed it.
Now, I hope you guys learned about toddler development as much as I did, and I'll see you all in the next episode.
You've been listening to Raising Parents, the Parenting Science Insights podcast, produced by the Parenting Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps other people find it so that we can grow and bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website at pa.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Dina Sargeant. Thanks for tuning in.